Viktor Frankl begins his philosophy inside a reality where nearly every ordinary source of meaning had been stripped away, where human dignity was systematically crushed, where suffering surrounded every moment of existence, and where survival itself became uncertain from one hour to the next. And it is precisely from this confrontation with extreme suffering that his philosophy gains its unusual force. Because he does not speak about meaning as a comforting abstraction created from safety and distance, but as something discovered within conditions that seem designed to destroy the human spirit entirely. What he observes in those conditions becomes the foundation of his understanding of human existence. He notices that people can endure astonishing levels of pain, deprivation, fear, humiliation, and loss if they still perceive some reason to continue living, some future task, responsibility, love, or purpose that reaches beyond immediate suffering itself. And conversely, when this sense of meaning disappears completely, individuals often collapse internally long before physical destruction arrives. The body weakens, but more importantly, the will to continue weakens. And once existence no longer appears connected to anything meaningful, despair begins consuming the person from within. This leads him toward one of his central convictions, that the deepest human motivation is not pleasure, as Freud argued, nor power, as Adler suggested, but meaning. Human beings fundamentally seek a reason for existence, a sense that their lives matter within a larger context. And this search remains active even in terrible conditions because meaning is not dependent upon comfort or success. A person may lose possessions, status, security, relationships, physical freedom, and still retain the ability to orient themselves toward meaning through the attitude they choose toward unavoidable suffering. He becomes deeply focused on the distinction between external circumstances and inner freedom. Human beings are always influenced by conditions beyond their control. Yet even under immense oppression, there remains a final human freedom, the ability to choose one's attitude toward what cannot be changed. And this freedom may appear small compared to overwhelming external forces. But for him, it remains spiritually decisive because it preserves the possibility of dignity even in situations designed to erase individuality entirely. What makes this insight powerful is that he does not romanticize suffering. He does not claim suffering is inherently good or that pain automatically produces wisdom. Suffering in itself is simply suffering, often brutal and meaningless on the surface. Yet when suffering becomes unavoidable, individuals still possess the ability to determine whether they will be destroyed internally by it or whether they will transform it into a form of spiritual achievement through courage, endurance, sacrifice, compassion, or responsibility. Responsibility becomes one of the central pillars of his philosophy because he believes meaning is never something passively invented according to personal preference alone. Meaning arises through responding to life itself. Existence continuously asks something from every individual, and the task of human beings is not merely to demand what they expect from life, but to answer what life demands from them in each unique situation. And this reversal changes the entire orientation of existence, because it shifts focus away from self-centered desire toward responsibility for something beyond oneself. For him, every moment contains potential meaning, because every moment presents a possibility for action, love, decision, endurance, or moral response that will never exist again in exactly the same way. Human life is finite, and this finitude gives each situation urgency. Once a moment passes, it becomes permanently fixed within reality, transformed into part of existence itself. And therefore, every choice matters because it contributes to the kind of person one becomes and the kind of life one ultimately creates. He identifies several primary paths through which meaning can be discovered. One is through creative work or action, through giving something to the world, building, creating, helping, serving, or accomplishing tasks that extend beyond the self. Another is through love, because love allows individuals to encounter the deepest reality of another human being, seeing not merely their external condition, but their inner possibilities and spiritual essence. Through love, people transcend isolation and recognize value that cannot be reduced to utility or circumstance. Yet he believes the deepest and most difficult form of meaning emerges through suffering itself, when suffering cannot be avoided. In such moments, meaning no longer depends upon changing external reality, but upon transforming one's inner relationship to it. A person facing illness, loss, imprisonment, failure, or death may still retain the ability to confront these realities with dignity, courage, and spiritual freedom. And this capacity reveals something profound about human existence, that meaning can survive even where happiness cannot. This understanding shapes his therapeutic approach, known as logotherapy, which centers on helping individuals rediscover meaning rather than merely reducing symptoms or satisfying desires. He sees many forms of psychological suffering emerging from what he calls the existential vacuum, a condition where individuals lose a sense of direction and purpose, drifting through life without deeper orientation, often masking emptiness through distraction, entertainment, addiction, conformity, or obsessive pursuit of pleasure and success. Modern society particularly concerns him because he believes increasing comfort and technological advancement do not necessarily produce fulfillment. In fact, when traditional structures of meaning weaken and individuals gain more freedom without corresponding responsibility, many experience profound emptiness because they no longer know what their freedom is for. They possess possibilities but lack direction, movement without purpose, stimulation without significance. He notices that many people attempt to escape this emptiness by conforming completely to social expectations, allowing society to dictate desires and goals for them, while others pursue power, consumption, or pleasure endlessly, hoping these will fill the void inside them. Yet these pursuits often fail because they remain centered on the self rather than on meaningful engagement with life beyond the self. Paradoxically, he believes happiness cannot be pursued directly. The more individuals obsessively chase happiness as a goal in itself, the more elusive it becomes because happiness emerges indirectly as the byproduct of meaningful living. A person absorbed in purpose, responsibility, love, or service may experience fulfillment precisely because attention has shifted away from constant self-monitoring toward participation in something larger and more important than immediate personal gratification. He also reflects deeply on mortality. Death, for him, does not make life meaningless, but intensifies meaning because human existence is temporary. Every moment is unrepeatable. Every opportunity eventually disappears forever. And because of this, individuals carry immense responsibility for how they use their limited time. Human beings cannot postpone authentic living indefinitely because existence remains finite and uncertain. Despite everything he witnessed, his philosophy refuses despair because he believes human beings always retain the possibility of spiritual transcendence. Circumstances may limit external freedom severely, yet individuals continue possessing the capacity to choose courage over surrender, compassion over bitterness, responsibility over passivity, and meaning over nihilism. And this possibility remains alive until the final moment of existence itself. Underneath all his reflections lies a profound respect for the resilience of the human spirit, not naive optimism, but the recognition that even in darkness people remain capable of preserving dignity, purpose, and humanity when they orient themselves toward meanings greater than suffering alone. And through this orientation, existence itself becomes bearable, not because pain disappears, but because pain becomes integrated into a larger framework of significance that prevents despair from having the final word. As his philosophy unfolds further, he begins examining more deeply the spiritual crisis hidden beneath modern civilization, recognizing that human beings can suffer not only from physical deprivation or visible tragedy, but from an inner emptiness that quietly spreads even within comfortable and prosperous societies. And this emptiness emerges when individuals lose connection to meaning, responsibility, and purpose, drifting through existence without any deeper orientation capable of sustaining them during suffering, failure, loneliness, or uncertainty. He sees modern individuals surrounded by unprecedented freedom and possibility, yet paradoxically more psychologically lost than ever before because freedom alone does not automatically provide direction. When traditional beliefs, communities, and moral structures weaken, people are often left standing before a vast openness without knowing how to respond to it. And in this vacuum, many begin searching desperately for substitutes that temporarily distract them from confronting the deeper question of why they are living at all. This is why he believes boredom has become one of the defining psychological conditions of modern life. People are constantly stimulated yet internally restless, endlessly entertained yet spiritually dissatisfied, because distraction cannot replace meaning. A person may fill every hour with activity, consumption, social approval, or ambition and still feel an invisible hollowness underneath everything, a feeling that life is moving without truly going anywhere. He notices that many individuals attempt to escape this emptiness through conformity, allowing society to dictate values and goals on their behalf, because choosing independently is frightening. To determine one's own responsibilities requires self-confrontation, uncertainty, and moral courage, while conformity offers the comfort of external guidance. People begin measuring themselves according to trends, expectations, careers, status, popularity, or collective opinion rather than asking what unique task life may be asking of them personally. Others attempt to escape through pleasure or power, hoping achievement, control, or stimulation will silence existential dissatisfaction. Yet these pursuits often intensify emptiness rather than curing it because they remain centered upon the self. The more individuals obsessively monitor their own happiness or success, the more trapped they become inside themselves, unable to transcend their own anxieties long enough to participate meaningfully in the world beyond personal gratification. This leads him toward an important insight about self-transcendence. Human beings become healthiest not when they focus endlessly upon themselves, but when they direct themselves toward purposes, responsibilities, people, or causes beyond themselves. Existence gains depth when attention moves outward rather than remaining imprisoned within constant self-analysis and self-concern, and therefore meaning cannot be discovered through isolation from life, but through engagement with it. Love becomes central within this framework because he sees love as one of the highest ways human beings transcend themselves. To genuinely love another person means perceiving their inner potential even when circumstances obscure it, recognizing the deeper reality of who they are beyond temporary conditions or appearances. And through this recognition, individuals help call forth possibilities within one another that may otherwise remain unrealized. For him, love is not merely emotional attachment or romantic satisfaction. It is an act of profound spiritual attention where one person affirms the uniqueness and dignity of another consciousness. Even in situations of immense suffering, memories of love can preserve meaning because they connect individuals to realities that transcend immediate pain and remind them that human existence contains values greater than suffering itself. He also reflects on work and creative action, understanding that human beings long to contribute something meaningful to reality, to leave behind actions, creations, responsibilities fulfilled, or lives touched by their existence. Meaning often emerges when individuals recognize that there are tasks only they can fulfill in precisely the way their unique experiences and abilities allow, and this uniqueness gives every life irreplaceable significance. No two people carry exactly the same responsibilities because no two lives occupy the same position within existence. Every person stands before situations that will never occur again in exactly the same form. And therefore, every individual possesses a unique relationship to meaning that cannot simply be copied from others. What gives one person purpose may not fulfill another, because meaning is discovered concretely within lived reality rather than abstract formulas. This is why he rejects nihilism so strongly. Nihilism claims life lacks objective meaning entirely, yet he believes meaning exists potentially within every situation, even if individuals fail to perceive it immediately. Meaning may not always appear dramatic or grand. Sometimes it emerges quietly through small acts of courage, patience, honesty, sacrifice, kindness, or endurance performed within ordinary life. And these moments matter because they shape the moral and spiritual reality of existence itself. He becomes especially interested in attitude because there are situations where external action becomes impossible, where suffering cannot be removed, illness cannot be cured, or loss cannot be reversed. And in such moments, the final area of freedom remaining is the attitude one chooses toward unavoidable reality. This does not eliminate pain, but it transforms the meaning of suffering by allowing individuals to preserve dignity instead of collapsing into despair. He observes that people who survive profound suffering often do so because they remain connected to future-oriented meaning. Some hold onto the hope of seeing loved ones again. Others dedicate themselves to unfinished work, responsibilities, faith, or the determination to bear witness to truth. These future meanings create spiritual tension, pulling individuals forward even when present reality feels unbearable. Without future orientation, existence begins collapsing inward. Human beings require a sense that life still expects something from them tomorrow. Once individuals believe nothing meaningful remains ahead, psychological decline accelerates because the spirit loses direction, and therefore hope becomes less about optimism and more about maintaining orientation toward purpose despite uncertainty. He also insists that suffering should never be sought unnecessarily. If pain can be reduced or prevented, individuals have responsibility to do so. There is no virtue in meaningless suffering itself. The dignity of suffering appears only when suffering becomes unavoidable and individuals still choose to confront it with humanity rather than surrendering entirely to bitterness, hatred, or hopelessness. This understanding gives his philosophy a rare balance between realism and spiritual resilience. He never denies tragedy, mortality, cruelty, or despair. He witnessed too much suffering to indulge in shallow positivity. Yet neither does he accept that suffering destroys all meaning. Instead, he believes meaning remains possible under nearly all conditions because human beings retain the ability to respond consciously to existence rather than merely reacting mechanically to circumstances. As his thought continues deepening, it becomes increasingly clear that he sees life itself as a constant dialogue between the individual and existence, where every moment asks something unique from each person, and fulfillment emerges not from demanding that life satisfy personal expectations, but from answering these demands with responsibility, courage, and openness to meanings that often reveal themselves only through struggle, sacrifice, and perseverance. As his philosophy moves deeper into the nature of human existence, he becomes increasingly concerned with the way modern people misunderstand suffering itself, because many assume that a meaningful life must be free from pain, conflict, uncertainty, or tragedy. And when suffering inevitably arrives, they experience not only the suffering itself, but also the collapse of their expectations, feeling betrayed by existence because they believed happiness and comfort were supposed to be permanent, conditions rather than fragile and temporary experiences. He believes this misunderstanding leaves individuals spiritually unprepared for reality. Human life inevitably contains loss, illness, aging, disappointment, separation, failure, and death. And any philosophy that pretends otherwise ultimately weakens people because it encourages them to build their sense of meaning entirely upon conditions that could disappear without warning. A person whose identity depends completely upon success, pleasure, health, or external stability becomes vulnerable to despair the moment these things begin collapsing. This does not mean human beings should reject joy, or seek suffering unnecessarily, but rather that meaning must reach deeper than temporary emotional states. Happiness cannot serve as a stable foundation for existence because emotions constantly fluctuate. One day may contain peace while another contains grief. Yet beneath these changing conditions, individuals still require a reason to continue living, acting, loving, and enduring. And this reason must be strong enough to survive periods when life becomes painful or uncertain. He sees that many people fear suffering so intensely that they organize their entire existence around avoiding discomfort at all costs. Yet this endless avoidance often shrinks life itself. Individuals become trapped within narrow routines designed primarily for safety and emotional protection, avoiding risks, commitments, responsibilities, or relationships that might expose them to pain. And in doing so, they gradually lose contact with the deeper dimensions of existence that make life meaningful in the first place. For him, meaning often emerges precisely through tension rather than comfort. Human beings require something to strive toward, responsibilities that call them beyond passivity, purposes that create movement toward the future. And when life lacks this tension entirely, stagnation begins setting in. A completely tensionless existence may appear peaceful externally, yet internally it often produces emptiness because the human spirit longs not merely for relaxation, but for significance. This is why he believes responsibility lies at the center of psychological health. People do not become fulfilled simply by satisfying impulses or eliminating discomfort. Fulfillment arises when individuals recognize that they are needed by something or someone beyond themselves, when they understand that their existence carries obligations that only they can fulfill. Responsibility creates direction because it pulls individuals outward into engagement with reality instead of leaving them trapped within endless self-concern. He reflects deeply on the uniqueness of every human life. No person can ever be replaced completely because no one else occupies exactly the same position in time, relationships, memory, experience, and possibility. Each individual, therefore, carries singular responsibilities that disappear forever if neglected. And this uniqueness gives profound weight to existence because every decision contributes to a life that can never be repeated. Time itself becomes morally significant within his philosophy because every moment represents an opportunity that will never return. Human beings often imagine the future as endless, postponing authentic living indefinitely. Yet life remains finite and uncertain. Eventually possibilities close forever. Relationships end, bodies weaken, opportunities vanish. And therefore existence demands conscious participation now rather than endless delay. At the same time, he rejects despair over mortality because he believes the past remains permanently preserved within reality once lived. Every meaningful action, every act of courage, love, sacrifice, endurance, or integrity becomes part of existence forever. Even though moments pass, they are not erased. They become completed realities that can never be undone, and therefore human life accumulates meaning through what has genuinely been lived and realized. This understanding transforms his view of death itself. Death limits human life, but limitation gives shape and seriousness to existence. Without finitude, choices would lose urgency because everything could always be postponed endlessly. Mortality forces individuals to recognize that life consists of concrete opportunities requiring response within limited time, and this awareness intensifies responsibility rather than negating meaning. He also becomes interested in the relationship between suffering and human dignity. Extreme suffering can strip away illusions, possessions, status, and external identity, exposing something deeper beneath them. The question of whether a person can preserve inner humanity when nearly everything else has been taken away, and he witnessed individuals responding to suffering in radically different ways. Some became cruel, selfish, and spiritually broken. Others retained compassion, generosity, humor, or moral courage even under horrific conditions, revealing that circumstances influence people profoundly without fully determining them. This observation strengthens his belief in spiritual freedom. Human beings are never completely reducible to biology, psychology, or environment because they retain the ability to take a stand toward their own condition. Even when external freedom disappears almost entirely, an inner freedom remains possible. The freedom to choose one's orientation towards suffering, responsibility, and meaning. He understands, however, that this freedom is difficult. It requires conscious effort and cannot be romanticized. Despair, fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness are real forces that can overwhelm individuals, especially when suffering becomes prolonged or meaningless in appearance. Yet he insists that the possibility of meaning remains alive even then, sometimes hidden deeply beneath pain, waiting to be discovered not through abstract theories, but through concrete acts of endurance and response. He criticizes modern psychological approaches that reduce human beings entirely to mechanisms driven by instinct or conditioning, because such reduction strips existence of responsibility and spiritual depth. Human beings are not machines reacting automatically to stimuli. They are beings capable of reflection, moral choice, sacrifice, and transcendence. And any understanding of psychology that ignores these dimensions remains incomplete. What he ultimately seeks is not merely therapy in the clinical sense, but rehumanization, helping individuals rediscover themselves as responsible beings capable of responding meaningfully to life instead of drifting passively through existence. Psychological healing, therefore, depends not only upon analyzing the past or satisfying desires, but upon reconnecting people with future-oriented meaning that gives suffering context and life direction. As these reflections continue unfolding, his philosophy becomes less a system of abstract concepts and more a profound affirmation that life retains potential meaning under nearly all circumstances, and that human beings, even when wounded, frightened, or exhausted, still possess the capacity to orient themselves toward truth, love, courage, responsibility, and purpose in ways that preserve dignity against the forces of despair and nihilism constantly threatening to consume them. As his philosophy reaches its final depth, everything returns to a simple but demanding truth that human life is never fully defined by what happens to a person, but also by how that person responds to what happens, because circumstances alone cannot determine the spiritual meaning of existence. Human beings may be wounded, restricted, humiliated, or broken externally, yet they still retain the possibility of choosing whether suffering will lead toward bitterness and despair or toward courage, dignity, and responsibility. He believes modern civilization often forgets this inner dimension of life. People become so focused on comfort, success, pleasure, and external achievement that they lose contact with the deeper question of what makes existence meaningful at all. And when crisis eventually arrives, many discover they have built their entire identity upon fragile conditions that can disappear overnight. Without deeper purpose, suffering feels empty and unbearable because nothing larger exists to contain it. For him, meaning is never something abstract handed equally to everyone. Each person must discover it within the concrete reality of their own life, through responsibilities, relationships, work, love, sacrifice, endurance, and the attitude they choose toward unavoidable suffering. Meaning changes from moment to moment because life continuously asks different things from different people, and therefore existence requires attentiveness rather than rigid formulas. He also insists that human beings are not meant to live entirely for themselves. The more individuals become trapped within obsessive self-focus, the more empty and anxious they often become. Fulfillment emerges indirectly when attention moves outward towards something greater than personal gratification, towards serving others, creating something valuable, loving deeply, or remaining faithful to responsibilities that give existence direction. Even suffering can become meaningful when it is faced with dignity rather than surrender. This does not make pain good or desirable, but it reveals that human beings possess the capacity to transform tragedy internally through the way they endure it. A person who continues loving, hoping, or acting morally despite suffering demonstrates a freedom deeper than circumstance itself. Death also gives urgency to life because time is limited. Opportunities disappear forever once neglected, and every choice contributes to the kind of person one becomes. Yet this finitude does not destroy meaning. It intensifies it. Every act of courage, compassion, honesty, or sacrifice becomes permanently part of reality once lived, something that can never be erased even after life ends. In the end, his philosophy becomes a defense of the human spirit against despair. He does not promise happiness, safety, or freedom from suffering, because existence can never offer such guarantees. What he offers instead is the conviction that life remains meaningful under nearly all conditions if individuals continue responding to it consciously and responsibly rather than collapsing into nihilism or passivity. And so his vision of existence leaves behind a quiet but enduring hope, the belief that even in darkness human beings still possess the ability to choose purpose over emptiness, responsibility over surrender, and meaning over despair, and that this inner freedom, however fragile, remains one of the deepest truths of human life itself. There are some philosophers who write about life from a distance, safely protected from the realities they analyze. Viktor Frankl wrote about meaning after watching civilization collapse into unimaginable horror. He wrote after losing his family, his freedom, his identity, and nearly his life inside Nazi concentration camps. And what makes Frankl so unsettling is that he did not emerge from that darkness preaching hatred, revenge, or despair. He emerged asking a question that still haunts millions of people today. Why do some human beings psychologically survive suffering while others collapse beneath it? This question became the center of his entire philosophy, because Frankl witnessed something inside the camps that shattered ordinary assumptions about human nature. The strongest prisoners did not always survive. The healthiest did not always survive. The most intelligent did not always survive. Some people physically weaker somehow preserved an inner strength that allowed them to continue enduring conditions almost impossible to imagine. And Frankl slowly realized that this strength often came from meaning. Not happiness, not comfort, meaning. Because when everything else is stripped away from a person, possessions, status, routines, certainty, freedom, even dignity itself, one terrifying question remains. What reason do I still have to continue living? Frankl believed this question sits quietly underneath all human existence, whether people consciously acknowledge it or not. Modern life often distracts individuals from confronting it directly. People become absorbed in work, entertainment, ambition, relationships, consumption, social approval, and routine. But beneath all distractions, every human being eventually encounters suffering, loss, mortality, loneliness, and uncertainty. And in those moments, pleasure alone is not enough to sustain the human spirit. Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905 during a period when psychology and philosophy were rapidly transforming Europe's understanding of the mind. Vienna was intellectually alive at the time. Sigmund Freud was revolutionizing psychoanalysis. New theories about desire, trauma, dreams, anxiety, and unconscious motivation were spreading across universities and intellectual circles. As a young man, Frankl became fascinated by psychology very early, but he gradually sensed something missing in many psychological theories of his era. Freud believed human beings were largely driven by pleasure and unconscious instinctual drives. Alfred Adler emphasized power, inferiority, and social striving. Frankl believed these explanations captured important parts of human behavior, but neither fully explained what he observed about life itself. Human beings often endure suffering voluntarily for the sake of something meaningful. Parents sacrifice for children. Artists sacrifice for creation. Soldiers sacrifice for ideals. Caregivers sacrifice for loved ones. Individuals tolerate enormous pain when they believe their suffering serves some deeper purpose. This observation became psychologically central for Frankl because it suggested the deepest human motivation was not pleasure or power alone. It was meaning. He called this the will to meaning. According to Frankl, human beings possess a profound psychological need to experience life as meaningful. Without meaning, people begin experiencing inner emptiness, restlessness, anxiety, boredom, aggression, or despair. A person may appear externally successful while inwardly feeling spiritually disconnected from existence itself. Frankl noticed this emptiness spreading through modern society long before World War II reached its full catastrophe. Traditional religious structures were weakening. Communities were becoming less stable. Rapid modernization was transforming daily life. Individuals had more freedom than previous generations, yet many also felt increasingly disoriented. People no longer knew what they were living for. And when human beings lose deeper orientation toward meaning, they often try filling the emptiness through distraction, endless entertainment, addiction, status, work obsession, pleasure-seeking, social approval, constant stimulation. But these rarely satisfy the deeper existential hunger underneath. Frankl believed modern civilization was quietly producing what he later called the existential vacuum, a psychological condition where life feels internally hollow despite external activity. This condition remains disturbingly recognizable today. Many people move through routines mechanically while feeling emotionally numb beneath the surface. Days blur together. Success loses emotional depth quickly. Relationships feel fragile. Attention becomes fragmented. Individuals feel surrounded by stimulation, yet disconnected from purpose. Frankl believed human beings cannot psychologically thrive without meaning because meaning gives suffering context. It gives sacrifice value. It gives struggle direction. Without meaning, even comfortable lives can begin feeling unbearable. And then history forced Frankl to test his philosophy against the darkest reality imaginable. When the Nazis rose to power, Jewish families across Europe faced escalating persecution, fear, and violence. Frankl had opportunities to escape to America before the full catastrophe unfolded. He possessed a visa that could have saved him, but he faced an agonizing decision: leave Europe and save himself, or remain with his parents. He chose to stay. Soon afterward, he and his family were deported into the concentration camp system. Over the following years, Frankl was transported through multiple camps, including Auschwitz. His father died. His mother died. His brother died. His pregnant wife died. Nearly everyone he loved disappeared into the machinery of genocide. Inside the camps, human beings were systematically stripped of individuality and dignity. Prisoners lost names and became numbers. Hunger became constant. Brutality became ordinary. Death surrounded daily life. People lived under exhaustion, terror, cold, humiliation, disease, and psychological degradation. Frankl later described how camp life destroyed normal assumptions about existence itself. Future plans vanished. Social identities vanished. Privacy vanished. Freedom vanished. Human beings were reduced almost entirely to survival. And yet within this horror, Frankl began observing something extraordinary. Some prisoners lost all psychological hope very quickly once they no longer saw meaning in continuing. Others somehow retained fragments of inner life despite everything surrounding them. Tiny acts of kindness survived inside enormous cruelty. Some individuals comforted others despite starvation. Some shared food despite hunger. Some preserved moral dignity even while surrounded by dehumanization. These moments deeply affected Frankl because they revealed something he believed no external power could fully erase: the final human freedom, the ability to choose one's inner attitude towards circumstances. This did not mean suffering was good. Frankl never romanticized pain or injustice. The camps represented horror beyond comprehension. But he became convinced that even in conditions of extreme suffering, human beings still retain some ability to decide who they become psychologically in response to suffering. And this realization would become one of the most powerful philosophical ideas of the 20th century. When Viktor Frankl was finally liberated from the camps, he stepped back into a world that no longer resembled the one he had once known. Entire cities had been shattered, families erased, moral certainty destroyed. Millions of people across Europe were carrying invisible psychological wounds that could not easily be explained or healed. And Frankl returned carrying grief almost beyond comprehension. His parents were gone. His brother was gone. His wife was gone. Nearly every part of his former life had vanished into the violence of history. He had every reason to collapse into bitterness or nihilism. Many people would have understood if he had concluded that life itself was meaningless after witnessing such horror. But Frankl reached the opposite conclusion. He became even more convinced that meaning is the deepest psychological necessity of human existence. Because inside the camps, he had observed something that transformed him permanently. Human beings could endure astonishing suffering if they still felt connected to some future purpose, responsibility, or reason to continue living. But once a person lost all inner orientation toward meaning, psychological collapse often followed rapidly. This insight became the foundation of the therapeutic philosophy he later called logotherapy. Unlike forms of psychology focused mainly on analyzing the past, unconscious drives, or emotional pleasure, Frankl focused on the future, on purpose, on responsibility, on the existential direction of a person's life. He believed one of the great mistakes modern people make is asking constantly what they expect from life. Instead, Frankl believed the deeper question is this: what does life expect from you now? This subtle shift changes everything psychologically. It transforms a person from a passive seeker of satisfaction into someone responsible for responding meaningfully to existence itself. Meaning is not something handed to people automatically. It must be discovered through action, love, sacrifice, creativity, endurance, and moral choice. Frankl believed every human being possesses unique responsibilities that cannot simply be replaced by someone else. A parent caring for a child, a writer finishing unfinished work, a person supporting loved ones through hardship. Even someone facing illness or suffering may still possess the responsibility to endure with dignity and courage. Meaning changes according to circumstances, but life never completely stops asking for a response. This was why Frankl rejected nihilism so strongly. He understood the temptation of nihilism after catastrophe. When societies collapse, when suffering feels random, when injustice appears overwhelming, many people begin believing nothing truly matters. Modern culture often intensifies this feeling through cynicism, distraction, consumerism, and emotional emptiness. Frankl saw this psychological emptiness spreading everywhere after the war. People appeared materially alive, but spiritually disconnected. Many individuals no longer knew what they were living toward. Traditional beliefs had weakened. Communities fragmented. Modern life became increasingly fast, competitive, and impersonal. Individuals pursued comfort, status, entertainment, and achievement while still feeling inwardly restless. Frankl called this condition the existential vacuum, and he believed it was becoming one of the defining psychological crises of modern civilization. The existential vacuum does not always appear dramatic externally. A person may continue functioning normally while internally feeling numb, aimless, or emotionally hollow. They move through routines without deeper purpose. Work becomes mechanical. Pleasure becomes repetitive. Distraction becomes constant because silence itself begins feeling uncomfortable. Without meaning, human beings often drift toward addiction, aggression, depression, escapism, or self-destruction because the mind cannot tolerate existential emptiness forever. This was one of Frankl's most important insights. Human beings are not psychologically sustained by comfort alone. A person can possess wealth, entertainment, and freedom while still feeling deeply miserable if life appears meaningless. At the same time, another person may endure extraordinary hardship while remaining spiritually resilient because they feel connected to something larger than immediate suffering. Frankl understood this personally because during the camps, he often survived psychologically by imagining future possibilities. He imagined lecturing students someday about the psychology of the camps. He imagined reconstructing his lost manuscripts. He imagined conversations that no longer existed physically but remained alive within memory and hope. Meaning allowed him to psychologically transcend immediate horror without denying its reality. And perhaps most importantly, Frankl believed suffering itself can become meaningful when approached with courage and dignity. This idea is often misunderstood. Frankl never claimed people should seek suffering unnecessarily. Avoidable suffering should always be reduced whenever possible. But some suffering is unavoidable. Illness, aging, loss, mortality, grief, failure, human vulnerability itself. The question then becomes whether suffering destroys the individual completely or becomes transformed through the attitude a person takes toward it. Frankl believed even unavoidable suffering can contain meaning if it deepens compassion, reveals inner strength, strengthens love, or allows a person to preserve dignity under terrible circumstances. This gave his philosophy extraordinary emotional power because it refused both naive optimism and hopeless despair. Life could remain meaningful even when painful. And for millions of people struggling with grief, trauma, loneliness, illness, and existential emptiness, this idea felt like psychological survival itself. As Viktor Frankl's philosophy began spreading across the world after the publication of Man's Search for Meaning, people responded to it with unusual emotional intensity because it spoke directly to a form of suffering many could barely articulate. Frankl was not only speaking to survivors of war or catastrophe. He was speaking to ordinary individuals living outwardly normal lives while carrying invisible emptiness inside them. This was one reason his work became so influential across different cultures and generations. Modern society had become materially advanced in many ways, yet psychologically many people still felt lost. Individuals were surrounded by technology, stimulation, entertainment, and increasing personal freedom. But beneath the surface, countless people quietly struggled with meaninglessness, anxiety, isolation, and spiritual exhaustion. Frankl believed modern civilization had created a dangerous imbalance. Human beings had learned how to live more comfortably, but not necessarily how to live more meaningfully. And this distinction mattered enormously, because comfort alone cannot satisfy the deepest psychological needs of the human spirit. A person can possess financial success, social approval, pleasurable experiences, and still feel internally empty if their life lacks deeper orientation. Frankl repeatedly encountered individuals who appeared externally successful while inwardly drifting through existence without purpose. This condition fascinated him because it revealed something important about human nature. People do not merely need stimulation to survive psychologically. They need meaning. Without meaning, even freedom itself can begin feeling unbearable. Human beings become restless. Time feels hollow. Motivation weakens. Distraction becomes addictive because silence forces confrontation with existential emptiness. Frankl saw this emptiness everywhere in post-war society. Individuals burying themselves in compulsive work, addiction, endless entertainment, status competition, pleasure-seeking, emotional numbness. Many people no longer knew what they were living toward, yet they continued moving mechanically through routines because stopping to confront the question directly felt frightening. What is my life actually for? Frankl believed this question cannot be escaped forever. Sooner or later, suffering, loss, aging, illness, failure, loneliness, or mortality force human beings to confront existence more deeply. And at that point, pleasure alone becomes psychologically insufficient. A person needs something capable of sustaining them when comfort disappears. This is why Frankl emphasized responsibility so intensely. Modern culture often frames freedom as the ability to avoid obligation and pursue personal desire without restriction. Frankl saw freedom differently. He believed authentic freedom requires responsibility because meaning often emerges through commitment to something beyond the self. A child needing care, a loved one depending on you, important work waiting unfinished, a moral principle worth defending, a person enduring suffering with dignity to spare others additional pain. These responsibilities pull individuals out of emptiness because they connect life to purpose larger than immediate gratification. Frankl also believed love possesses extraordinary psychological power because genuine love allows one person to perceive the deeper humanity of another beyond temporary circumstances. Inside the camps, prisoners often survived psychologically by holding on to memories of people they loved. Even when separated physically, love remained emotionally real enough to preserve inner life against despair. Frankl himself later described moments during forced labor in freezing conditions when thoughts of his wife became psychologically sustaining even though he did not know whether she was still alive. In those moments, he realized something profound. Human beings can experience meaning through love even in the absence of physical presence or external hope. Love allowed the human spirit to transcend immediate suffering. This realization became central to his philosophy because it demonstrated that meaning is not dependent entirely on external conditions. Circumstances matter enormously, of course. Frankl never minimized physical suffering or injustice, but he believed human beings still retain the ability to orient themselves toward meaning internally even during hardship. And this gave his philosophy enormous emotional force. He was not speaking theoretically about resilience from comfortable distance. He had witnessed human beings psychologically destroyed inside concentration camps, but he had also witnessed astonishing acts of courage, compassion, humor, sacrifice, and dignity surviving under conditions seemingly designed to erase humanity itself. These experiences convinced him that human beings possess depths greater than suffering alone. At the same time, Frankl remained deeply realistic about despair. He knew people can break psychologically. He knew trauma changes individuals forever. He knew grief leaves permanent scars. His philosophy was never simplistic positivity, pretending pain does not exist. In fact, one of the reasons his ideas resonate so deeply is because he took suffering seriously. Modern society often encourages individuals either to avoid suffering entirely or to hide it behind performance and distraction. Frankl confronted suffering directly. He believed unavoidable suffering becomes one of life's central existential tests. Not a test of strength in the heroic sense, but a test of meaning. Can a person still preserve humanity while suffering? Can dignity survive humiliation? Can compassion survive brutality? Can hope survive uncertainty? Can life remain meaningful even after tragedy? These questions sat at the center of Frankl's entire worldview because history had forced him to confront them under the worst possible conditions. And despite everything he endured, he refused to conclude that life itself was meaningless. Instead, he reached a more difficult and demanding conclusion. Meaning is not something human beings invent artificially to comfort themselves. Meaning is something life continuously asks individuals to discover through the way they love, endure, sacrifice, create, and respond to existence itself. As Viktor Frankl entered the later years of his life, he became more than a psychiatrist or philosopher. For many people, he became a witness to the deepest possibilities hidden inside human beings. Not because he had escaped suffering, but because he had walked directly through it without allowing it to completely destroy his faith in meaning, dignity, and human responsibility. This was what made his philosophy feel so different from shallow optimism. Frankl never claimed life was fair. He never promised that good people would avoid tragedy or that suffering always leads to wisdom. He had seen too much for such illusions. He knew history could become monstrous. He knew innocent people die. He knew grief can hollow out entire lives. He knew some wounds never fully heal. And yet he still believed something extraordinary about human existence. That even in a world filled with suffering, human beings retain the ability to shape the meaning of their lives through the way they respond to reality. This idea gave countless people psychological strength because it restored a sense of inner freedom many thought they had lost. Frankl understood that human beings often cannot control external circumstances. Illness arrives unexpectedly. Relationships collapse. Loved ones disappear. Aging transforms the body. Failure humiliates. Death waits for everyone eventually. Modern society spends enormous energy trying to distract itself from these truths. People chase stimulation constantly because silence often forces confrontation with mortality and emptiness. Many individuals organize life around avoiding pain rather than understanding it. But Frankl believed suffering avoided at all costs can paradoxically make people psychologically weaker and more disconnected from meaning itself. Because a life devoted only to comfort eventually becomes fragile. The moment hardship appears, many people suddenly realize they never developed a deeper reason for enduring existence beyond temporary pleasure or stability. Frankl wanted people to understand that meaning is strongest precisely when life becomes difficult. Not because suffering is inherently good, but because suffering strips away illusions. It forces human beings to confront what truly matters beneath routine and distraction. Inside the camps, status meant nothing. Wealth meant nothing. Public image meant nothing. Civilization itself had collapsed into brutality. What remained were the deepest elements of the human spirit: compassion, courage, love, responsibility, dignity, sacrifice. Frankl never forgot witnessing prisoners share food despite starvation or comfort others while facing death themselves. These moments convinced him that human beings always retain some capacity for moral choice no matter how terrible conditions become. And this belief shaped his understanding of freedom forever. Modern people often define freedom as the ability to do whatever they desire without restriction. Frankl saw freedom differently. True freedom was the ability to choose one's inner orientation responsibly, even when external control disappears. Without responsibility, freedom easily becomes emptiness. A society obsessed only with pleasure, consumption, and personal gratification often produces spiritually restless individuals because human beings crave significance deeper than entertainment can provide. People want to feel their existence matters. They want to believe their suffering is not meaningless. They want connection to something larger than immediate desire. Frankl believed this longing is fundamental to human psychology. And perhaps this is why his philosophy continues resonating so strongly generations later. Because modern life still contains the same existential hunger he described decades ago. People remain surrounded by stimulation while feeling internally disconnected. Many drift through routines, wondering privately whether their lives truly matter. Others achieve success only to discover achievement alone cannot answer deeper existential questions. What is worth suffering for? What gives life meaning when comfort disappears? What remains valuable in the face of death? Frankl did not offer simplistic answers because he believed meaning is deeply personal. No universal formula exists for every individual. One person discovers meaning through love, another through creative work, another through faith, service, endurance, family, or moral responsibility. But he believed life always contains potential meaning until the final moment of existence. Even suffering itself can become meaningful if it is faced with courage and dignity rather than total despair. This was why Frankl's philosophy gave hope to so many people facing illness, grief, imprisonment, trauma, depression, and loss. He did not deny pain. He entered directly into it and emerged carrying the conviction that human beings are capable of more resilience, depth, and spiritual strength than they often realize. And beneath all his work remained one quiet but profound challenge. Do not ask only what you expect from life. Ask what life is asking from you. Because for Viktor Frankl, meaning was never something passively received from the world. It was something human beings discover through the way they choose to live, love, endure, and remain human even when existence becomes unbearably difficult.